Thank you very much, and thank you to my hosts for inviting me to this very important conference today. There are at least four important questions about my topic, the first of which I heard last night, and not for the first time, which is whether randomized experiments are even possible in justice and crime prevention. And secondly, if they are, to what extent can field tests deliver treatments as they are randomly assigned? Which leads to, if the answer is yes, it's possible, then what difference have they made in what we know about justice, which is a different question from how much has justice changed or crime prevention changed in response to these trials. But that leads us to the final point very briefly about what other evidence is needed besides randomized trials to develop evidence-based policy on justice and crime prevention. So the first question about whether randomized experiments are even possible in justice and crime prevention goes back to 1936, which is the beginning of the first experiment in crime prevention, about 15 years prior to the beginning of the first modern trial, at least the one reported by Austin Bradford Hill on tuberculosis in London. The area I know best is policing, and there's really no good register of all criminological experiments, but I think my PhD student and former Chief Constable, Peter Neyroud, has the most comprehensive list, and he reckons that 107 randomized controlled trials in police practice have now been published. There are probably another 50 in the pipeline right now. So if we look at the numbers by year in this bar graph, the question that came up at the last session about whether the bubble is about to burst is hard to answer. In fact, if the bubble's getting bigger, maybe it's getting more likely to burst. But in any case, it is getting bigger. And that leads to the question of, well, are they any good? And my candid admission is that there's a whole lot of badly done randomized trials in social experiments, partly because a lot of people who are very good researchers jump into them without having a clue how they're going to find eligible cases and get them randomly assigned into the treatment groups. And they don't have a tradition of experienced clinical trialists to teach them. So yes, there's a problem. On the far right, what you see is that out of the 107 police experiments, 26 of them did not report whether there was non-compliance or compliance with the random assignment. They had no data, no tracking of treatment as delivered. But the good news is that the majority of the randomized trials in policing had at least 70% of the cases with treatment as delivered. And it's actually kind of an arguable comparison, especially if we're comparing diversion from court to a court outcome, when a large portion of the people who are prosecuted and told to go to court never go to court, and that's the control group. So it's a question of where you cut off the definition of treatment as assigned and some issues about efficacy versus effectiveness. In any case, it looks pretty good, and so we really should have had some of these differences, some of these randomized trials making a difference in knowledge right now in what we know about justice and crime prevention. And as my abstract said, almost from the very beginning, we've been discovering things that we thought were going to prevent crime that are actually increasing crime. Starting with the very first experiment, which is one of the 22 harmful effects that Brandon Welsh and his colleague found in going through 574 experimental and quasi-experimental studies in the 15 Campbell systematic reviews in crime and justice. With 22 harmful effects, it's a 1 in 26 tests showing that not just that programs don't work, but actually that they cause crime. So when we have the title, why must we do this? One answer is we need to find out what is actually causing crime, even though everybody thinks it's preventing crime. Certainly, the kinds of programs that have been found to cause crime are very surprising. The Cambridge-Somerville experiment randomly assigned one member of 258 matched pairs. It's kind of a precursor of random assignment, but very close for our purposes. And 30 years later, Joan McCord found that despite having a mentor who would see them several times a month, would take them to sports events, take them to concerts, spend time with them, because these boys had a very weak or absent father figure, or they had a father who was a drunk. So here's a clean-cut young 23-year-old who's spending time with them, being paid to be a professional mentor. That was in the treatment group, along with academic tutors, along with summer camp, along with access to doctors. And in the 30-year follow-up, all of that amounted to increasing the rate of reoffending once they became offenders, increased their death rates before the age of 40, reducing lifespan, and increased their commitment to mental institutions and lots of other wonderful outcomes of a program that we somehow must never do again. But for treatments in one random assignment formula, we don't know which of those was the most damaging. Nonetheless, it was important to know. You've already heard about the Scared Straight program, where young at-risk children, in fact, by law in Illinois, are required to be taken to a prison where the prisoners can tell them how bad it is in prison, because everybody knows that will scare them into not committing crimes, except for Anthony Petrosino's systematic review that Paul told you about, where the average effect of 7 trials is to increase crime overall by 70% in his latest update. And it's interesting now to get to the impact of this. Just a few days ago, the College of Policing in the UK reported that one of the elected policing crime commissioners was asked to fund a Scared Straight program. People love this program. They write to Anthony Petrosino and say, "You wrote a really great review. Can you tell me how I can start a Scared Straight program?" And he has to write back to them saying, "I think you misread the review." But Martin Underhill, the Police and Crime Commissioner for Dorset, very proudly announced that he's refused to fund Scared Straight because the evidence shows that the program backfires, and he's not going to put taxpayers' money into causing crime. Well, good for him. It's causing less of a ruckus than the mayor of Salt Lake City, Rocky Anderson, faced in 2001. When he decided to stop spending $1 million a year on having police officers in uniform go into schools to tell 12-year-old children, don't use drugs. They're really bad for you. It's a bad idea to use drugs and you'll regret it. So this program, the Drug Abuse Resistance Education Program, is used with millions of juveniles worldwide. Today, as we speak, there are police out there telling those 12-year-olds not to use drugs. And according to a police-led evaluation that is in cooperation with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, randomly assigning school districts to either have this program or not, the long-term, roughly 5-year follow-up of the program showed that DARE failed to prevent marijuana or any other kind of drug use, except it increased the use of alcohol and tobacco relative to controls not given the program. And once again, we know that. It's made a difference to our knowledge. Whether it makes a difference to practice, I think, depends on the larger role of randomized trials in education, crime, and other policy arenas. But perhaps the strongest reason you've heard about, and you've seen the evidence from Esther Duflo in development studies, this is David Weisbird's analysis of a review of 89 studies of prison and probation, in which there are 5 levels of the scientific method scale, the University of Maryland, so-called Maryland scale, that we developed in a report to the U.S. Congress. And level 1 is just a correlation. Level 2 is before after with no control group. Level 3 is before after in one unit compared to another unit, like one school compared to another school. Level 4 is several units matched as pairs. And level 5 is a randomized trial. You'll see that as the Donald Campbell kind of rigor increases from level 2 to level 5, the average effect size drops in a linear fashion. And if the expected mean effect size of randomized trials on correctional programs is 0, albeit with a small sample, then it raises the question of why the others don't get closer to that. But with all of that in mind, the fact that there are so many RCTs going on in policing gives us great reason to hope. And if the result of this conference is to persuade various decision makers that RCTs might be good even in just the arena of policing, I'd like to try to make the case for what we have added to our knowledge about how to police effectively with scarce resources, and certainly the duties of the police are growing almost exponentially in Europe right now on many fronts. But one thing that we have clarity about in this research is that police make lots of decisions. And they make decisions about offenders and perhaps should be making even better decisions about the kind of people who recruit new criminals into crime. You might say the epidemiology of offending. And that sometimes happens in places which are known as hotspots of crime. But the most important thing, and one I'd like to give you the most detail on, is the impact of police decisions on victims of crime. These 3 units of analysis, offenders, places, and victims, form the core of the growing body of knowledge from randomized controlled trials in policing. And if I can just show how the epidemiology preceding randomized trials has been a very important piece, I would review with you a 7-year study of 80,000 people arrested in Sacramento, California, in almost 130 cases with 250,000 charges for what offenses they committed in a city of about 500,000 people. What was found is that the people who were recruiting the first offenders as their co-arrestees, people who had prior records of offending and who were generally older than the younger people who they had recruited, they were in number 377, met the test, with 1,599 co-arrestees just for the crime of robbery, which is a very important crime because it can be very dangerous, in fact deadly, and it also is a kind of bellwether crime. These are the social networks that they were attached to, and it's important to remember that a recruiter has a wider social network of co-offenders, just based on people getting arrested together, not based on asking them who their favorite co-offender is. Fortunately, the official records provide lots of big data here. What difference does it make if we were to get the recruiters to stop recruiting? Well, the answer is that in robbery, 32% of the people who have been arrested for robbery in recent years in Sacramento, 1/3 almost, started their criminal careers with a recruiter. So we might have reduced the number of robbers by 1/3 if the recruiters hadn't been recruiting. So it's not 100% spread, as in perhaps HIV or other infectious diseases. But for all of these offenses, it's certainly a substantial portion of the active offender population that has come in through recruiters. So what do we do about them? Well, from that epidemiology in Sacramento with the University of Cambridge, a long way away, we were able to identify 206 prolific offenders who were randomly assigned to a treatment group from this larger group of 421, with the rest being in a control. You can see they've got roughly the same number of recruits. They had baseline comparability in terms of arrests. So all that looks pretty good for us to go out, and with half of them, there was an attempt by the officers to make face-to-face contact with the recruiters anywhere they could to kind of read a script and to remind the recruiter that they're subject to increased police scrutiny, and the contact that would be concluded with, now if you want to help yourself, this is where you can get a job, get yourself off drugs, get counseling, and so forth. So it wasn't just all nasty in-your-face police work. It's you've really got to go straight and stop recruiting these kids into crime. So this was the effect on the recruits. On the one hand, at the far left of the screen as you look at it, we had a 50% reduction in arrests by the recruits because of this contact with the recruiters in a random assignment context. The recruiters themselves had 47% fewer arrests, and in fact their entire network had a non-significant drop in arrests. So there was some diffusion of this rather than displacement of it to their other members in the criminal network. And whether arrests is a reliable measure of how much crime they're committing is an important question, but I think most of the police who would have arrested them didn't know that they were in this experiment because it's a big enough department. So that was not likely to have corrupted these effects. And so when we think about recruiters as hot people, high-risk people for crime, it brings us to thinking about hot spots of crime. And our discovery in Minneapolis in 1987, when it was first reported in the press, that 3% of the locations have 50% of the crimes, has in some ways revolutionized English-speaking policing. Just at the same time the IT revolution came along. It was a lot of what was being done in New York, for example, as they took the homicide rate down 90%. Many causes have been claimed for that, but it is a fact that it was part of the process. And this is actually the Japanese National Police Agency data for Tokyo. These are violent crime hotspots in Tokyo, mostly associated with train stations. If you're taking a train in Tokyo late at night, keep this in mind. On the other hand, the denominator of people available to rob and assault is very high, so you're probably individually safe even if the space is dangerous. The Japanese police were not interested in doing anything different with that information, but in the UK and the US, they have taken these two-dimensional maps and ramped them up. This is actually architectural software showing you the height of the crime count at these locations. And we have some ancillary findings, like if you put police in these hotspots, what's the optimum period for them to stay in the hotspots? Correlationally, it looks like it's 15 minutes. This Koper curve, one of my students who identified this, has been implemented, even used in experiments, but it wasn't itself developed by experimental assignment of the lengths of time, which I think is something that could be done. A systematic review of all of the replications of the first hotspots experiment that I did with David Weisbird in Minneapolis has shown overall benefits, but it also shows more evidence on why randomized trials are important. That is to say, if you look at the bottom, you're going to see the randomized trial evidence where the effect size are significantly in favor of treatment, but the effect size is smaller than when you do the quasi-experiments. And I can identify with this because I had the largest effect size in the quasi-experiments, and I had one of the smallest effect sizes in the randomized experiments. So I must be doing something honest, if not right. My primary reason to believe that RCTs are essential comes from 30 years of work on domestic violence, not the high-end serious injury kind of cases, but the common cold, if you will, the huge numbers of cases in which there's no injuries, but there's plenty of emotional and other kinds of damage. And historically in the U.S., police would go to these things, calm everybody down, and then leave. Then they tried mediation of the disputes, kind of like clinical psychologists, and they were trained by psychologists to do that. But there were no randomized trials. That was an evidence-free initiative that was adopted all over the country. And the advocates were saying, that's not enough, we've got to make arrests. And they actually changed the law to allow police to make arrests when they did not witness the offense. And that's the context in Minneapolis, where they had just changed the law in 1979. And the new police chief, who had been my mentor in the New York City Police Department, was able to persuade the city council unanimously to approve random assignment of arrest, because they weren't making the arrests, and they saw it as the only way to make the arrests was to introduce it by random assignment, which doesn't seem bad at all in principle. But they were certainly delighted when the initial findings showed that arrest worked best, that over a 6-month follow-up period, there was only a 10% rearrest rate for those who had been randomly assigned to arrest, that the other treatments had a higher recidivism rate, and that led to worldwide publicity. Hundreds of newspapers from Sydney to London to Los Angeles said, this is great. 28 state legislatures in the United States made it mandatory that they had to make these arrests. But we were pleading for replications, and we got them. And I did one of the replications in Milwaukee with an even tighter random assignment of arrest and removal with handcuffs so that neighbors could see you in jail for up to 72 hours, compared to just a warning and leaving the offender in the location. And this, again, was decided on the basis of police declaring the case eligible, phoning a research office, getting a random assignment, and then implementing it with 99% accuracy. What we found in Milwaukee was that arrest actually was heavily moderated by employment of the offenders, so that arrest worked very well on employed offenders, and in fact Minneapolis had a very high employment rate when that was the first site. Unfortunately, it made unemployed men more violent, and in the Miami replication you can see that it doubled the prevalence of arrest among unemployed men from 7% to almost 17%, a bit more than doubled, and for the unemployed men it cut it in half. Remarkably, with an African-American population in Milwaukee, a predominantly white working-class population in Omaha, Nebraska, and a predominantly Hispanic immigrant population in Miami, we had the same interaction effect. In fact, I don't know of another interaction effect in police experiments that has been replicated across 3 distinct demographic groups. But the more important finding, and even worse news from 23 years later, is that the good stuff that was happening with the employed men disappeared, that there was no overall difference, but if you just looked at the unemployed men, there was a persisting significant increase in the prevalence of domestic violence among the unemployed, and the benefit for the employed was certainly no longer significant. The key question turns out to be death. Many people thought that arrest for misdemeanors would prevent murder, but only 3 victims, happily, out of 1,125 in the experiment were murdered in 23 years. For all causes of death, however, there was a 64% increase in death for all causes of victims whose offenders had been arrested by random assignment. So arrest, this great, let's do something about this problem, has, at least in one city, contributed to an increase in mortality that began very early in the survival analysis, as you can see, and just got bigger and bigger. And we're going to keep following this one up. We're also trying to get data on other replications to see if the pattern was found in other cities. As an example, you can see the difference in heart attack deaths with a random assignment to arrest. You can also see that the effect is largely concentrated among African American women in one of the most segregated cities in the United States, concentrated poverty areas with a similar but very small effect for the white victims. And sadly, it's the employed victims in these poverty areas who have by far the biggest increase in mortality associated with random assignment to arrest. So to talk about how long you should follow up an experiment, when you need to get to the mortality, 23 years is certainly a good time period. We're working on an experiment right now. Dr. Heather Strang is leading this, and she's here with us today, where she has been aided by knowledge that 2% of the serious harm, 80% of the serious harm is concentrated among 2% of the couples in the latest English research. But with the low seriousness first case couples, who are the vast majority of all these couples, there's been random assignment to either have a workshop or just be left out of jail. After they've been arrested, they tell them to go home and do nothing, or they tell them they got to come back to these workshops of 3 hours. I won't describe the program, but so far it's working pretty well in terms of charges for domestic violence. There's been a 40% reduction in terms of the charges, the numbers of charges, not the prevalence, per 1,000 offenders, a 54% reduction. And what works for whom, I think, has got to be the key narrative here for something as big as domestic violence and as diverse. But randomized trials are not the only thing that we need in this field. We also need evidence on what I call the 3 T's. The targeting, that is identifying what works for whom, requires a disaggregation, a segmentation of the problems into different levels of seriousness and frequency, so that you would test appropriately to the target. But the key thing in a lot of the testing, including the hotspots experiments that I told you about, is to track not only during the test, but even after you get the test results. Most of the hotspots experiments have no measure of the independent variable. They know that it's in the treatment group. That's all they know. And they tell you what happened in the treatment group and what happened in the control group. And if there's a difference, they say, it's obviously because they did the treatment in the treatment group. How much? How much is needed? What difference does dosage make? It's all part of the marriage of data analytics and operations, which I think is making evidence-based policing very popular with the police. But just to give you an example, in Trinidad, with a very high homicide rate, we identified 200 homicide hotspots. And we were getting an average of 24 minutes per day per homicide hotspot when they first rolled out the strategy of policing those hotspots. With relentless pressure and comparing division commanders, 8 division commanders competing not to be humiliated at the weekly staff meeting, they used tracking to push up the number of minutes to even beyond this, 120 minutes a day, 2 hours per day of police coming and going in hotspots in a way that mimics a trial that has been done in Rajasthan with JPAL. And what it has been used for is to tell the police themselves what difference is making. And this graph in particular, where the yellow shows you the increase in the dosage level right across the entire island, and the red tells you the change in the homicide count from the year before, they have been very gratified to see the evidence that what they're doing is actually bringing down the murder rate. That's part of the reason that policing has, in a professional sense, identified a huge group of early adopters. 2,500 members now belong to the Society of Evidence-Based Policing. Police officers, for the most part, in the UK, Australia, the US, New Zealand, and Trinidad, promoting the use of randomized trials, designing their own randomized trials when they can, sometimes doing them badly, but sometimes doing them good enough. And if you go to this website, you'll find out lots of amazing things that are going on, which are promoting European police to have growing interest in this, with both Sweden and Denmark seriously considering a substantial investment in having their senior officers take master's degrees in evidence-based policing at Cambridge. Something we would certainly promote and welcome. We would be extremely happy to welcome French police or French prosecutors or anybody else from this great nation, because our vision for randomized trials in policing or justice of any sort is that it should be led by the practitioners much as it is in medicine, and that there should be a kind of merger of profession and research with career officers as clinical trial scientists, in which evidence becomes the basis for approved police or justice practices. And I'm very proud to announce that as of this October, we will have 7 police officers working full-time with part of their time allocated by their police agency to get a PhD in randomized trials to reduce crime and justice. So our bubble is getting bigger. I hope it doesn't burst. Thank you.
Oh, is there any question? Which?
Alain Replications from Paris. I've been very impressed by your presentation and your results, actually. It's not at all my area, but I have a small side question. I have no question regarding to the methodology and statistical analysis. It's impressive. But in other areas, for example, in medicine or in the social sciences, when you do an intervention, you have to present the protocol or the design of the study before an ethics committee to see whether the intervention is. And I was wondering whether or did you manage the fact that your intervention was to arrest or not some people at random, and whether there's been a discussion by an ethical committee, because of course it's a big decision which has to do with freedom of walking. And do you recall this part of the discussion around that?
I could narrate you the conversations we had. In 1980, the National Institute of Justice peer review group approved the methodology of random assignment of arrest after the National Academy of Sciences of the United States had recommended random assignment of arrest and other criminal sanctions in 1979. In 1981, the Supreme Court's U.S. Federal Judicial Center published a volume called Experimentation in the Law. They said, not only is it ethical to use random assignment of punishment, it is absolutely ethically necessary, because if you don't do the tests, you don't know whether you're making things worse. And that's far worse than whatever feelings of uneasiness there might be about random assignment, compared to the fact that there's so much prejudice, bias, and maliciousness in deciding who to punish anyway. Random assignment turns out to be much fairer than ordinary practice. So once you then take it up to an elected body like the city council, and they, on behalf of the people, democratically say, we will do random assignment, I think you've done your homework. Yeah, good.
Maybe just, Pierre.
You know, we have looked at this problem in a different way. At the science at school, we have very young, pupils who are interested in the scientific police. So they go for a week in the school of the police to learn how do you get the fingerprints, how do you get a picture of what is happening. The idea being, of course, the experiment, the science, but also that there is no chance to escape when you're caught.
Well, I think it sounds like a great program to be tested with a randomized controlled trial. And wouldn't it be interesting if they get so confident that they know about police techniques that they commit more crime if they have the program than if they don't? Anything's possible, right?
Just one short question. I was very interested by the dichotomy between employed and non-employed. And do you know the reason? Is it because the shame of being arrested when you have job partners? Or is it because you lose your job? Or
there was baseline unemployment. So the status I was talking about was their status at the time they were arrested. So it wasn't a losing the job effect because they got arrested. But I think the best thing I can say about this, which goes right back to James Lynn's experiments on scurvy, is that it's not important to know why you're getting the effect you are. And truthfully, I don't know why we have those interactions. I certainly don't know why there was a higher death rate for the victims. And that's where I think what Esther Duflo was talking about in terms of mechanism experiments is definitely part of the toolbox for experiments, but we have not had enough time or resources to be able to explore those mechanisms, and I think that's a big gap in what we have done so far. I hope we can fill it. Good, thank you.
So thank you.
Thank you all.